Welcome to Tales from a Retro Gamer, episode number 3. I'm super excited about this episode because we're flashing back to the Christmas of 1982 when I got my ColecoVision. That was the first game console that I actually owned, the first one I could call my own. Now before that, the years leading up before 1982, I played a lot of video games, but they were always at a friend's house or the arcades. So, for example, my two best friends in 1976, they each had the Fairchild Channel F system. Back then it was called the Fairchild VES, Video Game Entertainment System. They were the only people I knew that had that, but it just so happened my two best friends that lived near me had the Fairchild. I would go over their house and play, and it was a ton of fun. And then 1977, my friends started getting Atari 2600 consoles, Atari VCS at that time. And that was super exciting. It was great. I loved to go over and play combat, two-player combat, and then later Space Invaders and all that good stuff. Loved it, Pac-Man. And I was content with that. All my cousins and friends, everybody that had a game console, I knew which consoles they had, which games they had. I would ride my bike over there on family trips. I would play their game consoles. I was happy with that. The thought of having my own game console just kind of didn't seem real because they were so expensive. So I was content because tons of two-player games, we'd get together with friends playing. I was perfectly happy with that. Except that all changed in the summer of 1982. That's when when Coleco started showing their commercials for their advanced ColecoVision video game system. So what this commercial showed was this guy would walk up to this arcade game and these 3D ships were shooting out of the screen. And even at the time, I was 14, I knew that was just hyperbole. I thought that's just amped up to get your attention, and it really did. It grabbed my attention. I thought it looked really cool. What really did the trick was when they started showing on that same commercial the screenshots for Donkey Kong. So I could not believe what I was seeing. You were seeing these kids playing ColecoVision on the TV, and it was Donkey Kong looking exactly like the arcade game. And to my eyes, it was identical. Cartoon-like. That was an early story-driven game with cartoon-like characters. The kind of game that you really couldn't replicate at home until the ColecoVision came along. So I knew I had to get a ColecoVision of my very own. I needed this in my house, just the thought of being able to play a game like that, and who knows what other games the system would have. I knew I had to have one, but here was the problem. For our Christmases, cutoff was $100. We knew Christmases, which was a lot back then. You could get a bicycle, all kinds of toys. $100 was great, but video game consoles were really expensive. Atari 2600 started off at $250. The Intellivision was $300 when it came out. And even at that point in 1982, they were still over $100. And the ColecoVision was about $200. So what was I going to do? So I was 14. It wasn't like when I was much younger and the Pong came out and I had no way to make a whole lot of money. At that point, I was mowing yards. I was doing chores for neighbors, that kind of thing. So I actually had these little, part-time jobs. And so what I did was I mowed a ton of yards that summer, and I saved up around $150. And so what I did was loan that money to Santa Claus, i.e. the folks. They kicked in their $100. And so Christmas morning of 1982, I turned 15 at that point. I woke up. I had a brand spanking new ColecoVision, there was this big box under the tree. And of course, that was the first present I opened. And I was super excited. This big, enormous box, ripped it open, and there it was, a ColecoVision game console in all its glory. I was so excited. And I opened the box, and you open up, you take out the console, you take out the Donkey Kong cartridge and the controllers, and it was just so new and black and shiny. And it wasn't like going over and playing other game consoles because these had some wear. They were sitting out, they were on the floor, maybe some had dust. Maybe a kid's little sister had spilled a drink on it. It was used and it was somebody else's. But to have a brand new game console of my very own with that new car smell was just super, super exciting. So I loved it. And that night I played ColecoVision all night long. I played the Donkey Kong game that came with it. And even better was the mousetrap. So since I had saved up $150, my parents kicked in $100, there was enough for an extra game. So I had a mousetrap game to go with it. And it was just about arcade perfect. It was amazing. So I played those two games late into the night, and it was super fun. Now, unlike most people from that era that were getting video games, I kept the boxes. Like I kept the ColecoVision box, I kept the mousetrap box, and I kept the boxes because I love the art. Most people would just throw them away, which is nowadays why, boxes for those original games sometimes go for more than the games themselves because they're hard to find. So school started up January, early 1983, and several of my best friends had gotten ColecoVisions as well because it was a really hot, super popular system. If you got the ColecoVision, that was the cool system to get. Suddenly the Atari 2600 was seemed lame by a lot of people, and so several of my friends had ColecoVisions. Once again, I would take off on my bicycle, go to my friends' houses that had game systems, but instead this time, instead of me not having my own game console, what I would do is go over and I would take some of my games so they could play them, and then I would borrow some games from them. So, you know, video games, ColecoVision games were $30. Zaxxon was actually $50, and mine are 2049er, which would come out a little later. That was $50 as well. And, you know, but most of the games were $30, which was still quite a bit of money. And so we would pool our games together. We would have, you know, play some two-player couch co-op. We would borrow each other's games. And that was super cool. That was like expanding your library without spending more money. So that was great. Now at 16, I got a job, and so suddenly I had plenty of money to buy a bunch of games. I worked at Luther's Barbecue. I started off as a busboy, worked my way up to fry cook. I became a supervisor. Even at 16, I'm telling 30 and 40-something-year-olds what to do, which they definitely resented, but what did I care? I got bumped up from $3.35 an hour to $5.50, which was great at that time. So I was going to the Northeast Mall, the North Hills Mall in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, buying games, and I loved the ColecoVision. Tons of great arcade ports. There were some cool third-party titles. Excellent stuff. There was a good variety of genres, racing games, platform games, maze games, shooters. Such a great system. And then suddenly when I was going to the, later in 1983, I'm going to these stores and I suddenly see these big bins filled with cheap games. Like, wow, games anywhere from $5 to $10 each, ColecoVision, Atari 2600, Atari 5200, Vectrex, all these game consoles. The games started getting super cheap, a lot of them. And so I was like, well, that's really weird. And it worked out great for me because I was buying lots of extra games. This was, I didn't know anything. I didn't know it was a video game crash, but now everybody calls it, you know, the great video game crash of 1983. All I knew was I was buying a ton of great games for really cheap. A ton of not so great games too, because, you know, there was a lot of shovelware produced for the Atari 2600 and other consoles at that time. But the video game crash is a subject for another day. At some point, probably soon, I will do a video game crash episode of Tales from a Retro Gamer. So anyway, so up until this day, I'm still collecting ColecoVision games. I've got well over 100 in my collection. One other thing about the ColecoVision, although I did collect the boxes and keep the boxes, there was one point, probably late 80s, 88, 89, I decided it would be a brilliant idea to throw away all my ColecoVision game boxes. I had around 80 games at that point. And I thought, you know, to make more room in my shelves, you know, in my bedroom, I'm just going to throw all these boxes out. Huge fatal mistake. But again, that's a tale for another time. So yeah, so what do you think? So comment below, what game console, what was your first game console? What Christmas do you remember where you just wake up and you're like, wow, you got an Atari or an NES or a Nintendo 64? Or if you're younger, maybe a PS2 was your first game console, whatever the case. Comment below with your favorite game system or your memories of the ColecoVision or anything like that. Be sure to subscribe below the video to the right. Click on the subscribe button. That would be awesome. Like the video, thumbs up. Thanks for tuning in. Appreciate it. Peace out.